and nearly dropped my coffee when I saw a white SUV flailing in a pool of brown water by my driveway, and a certain HOA tyrant wading in like a drowned pageant queen, clipboard flailing and curse words flying. Let's just say her compliance campaign met its match in a bit of old-school geology, a weather forecast, and one mischievous grandson. She thought her rules would bury us, but nature's got rules too. Folks, this muddy showdown is about to turn HOA policy into HOA poetry. Comment where you're watching from, because what happens next is wetter, weirder, and way more satisfying than it should be. It was early March when I first laid eyes on Beverly Sterling. I was out on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky orange over what we called Hartwell Ranch. 5 acres of rolling Texas hill country that my family had owned since 1985. Back when this area was nothing but farms and the occasional neighbor a mile down the road. But times change, and over the past 3 years, a housing development called Pristine Valley Estates had sprouted up around us like wildflowers after a good rain. These weren't just any houses. These were cookie-cutter mansions with perfectly manicured lawns and residents who seemed to have forgotten that people used to actually live off the land. Beverly Sterling was the kind of woman who announced herself without saying a word. She drove up in a white SUV so clean it could have been featured in a car commercial, stepped out wearing a powder blue pantsuit that screamed, "I mean business," and marched toward my front gate carrying a leather portfolio. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight I wondered if it was giving her a headache, and she wore enough jewelry to stock a small shop. But what really caught my attention was that clipboard. In my 43 years of teaching geology, I'd learned that people who carried clipboards outdoors usually meant trouble. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," she called out in a voice sweet as honey pie, but with an undertone that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm Beverly Sterling, president of the Pristine Valley Estates Homeowners Association. I was hoping we could have a quick chat about community standards." I invited her to sit on the porch, offered her some coffee, and listened as she explained her vision for our little corner of Texas. According to Beverly, Pristine Valley Estates was in the running for the county's Community Excellence Award, a prestigious honor that would put our area on the map as the finest planned community in Central Texas. The problem, Beverly explained with increasing enthusiasm, was that to win this award, the community needed 100% compliance with aesthetic guidelines. Every lawn needed to be perfectly trimmed, every house needed to match the approved color palette, and every resident needed to understand that individual preferences came second to community appearance. She pulled out a thick binder filled with photos of houses in other award-winning communities, each one looking like it had been designed by the same architect. "Now, Mr. Hartwell," she said, flipping to a page marked with colorful tabs, "I understand you've lived here for quite some time. But as our community grows, we all need to adapt to maintain our property values." I took a long sip of my coffee and looked out over my land. Wild grasses swayed in the morning breeze, mesquite trees provided shade for the handful of cattle I kept, and native wildflowers dotted the landscape in patches of yellow and purple. "Mrs. Sterling," I said carefully, "I appreciate what you're trying to do with your community, but this ranch has been in my family for nearly 40 years. These native plants and grasses aren't just decorative, they're part of the natural ecosystem. They prevent erosion, provide habitat for local wildlife, and frankly, they've been here a lot longer than any of us." Beverly's smile never wavered, but I noticed her grip tighten on that clipboard. "I understand your attachment to the property, Mr. Hartwell, but we're all part of the same community now. The County Inspection Committee will be evaluating the entire area, and unfortunately, unkempt natural areas can negatively impact our score." She pulled out a formal-looking document and placed it on the table between us. "This is just a friendly reminder about our community guidelines regarding lawn maintenance and aesthetic compliance. Nothing too demanding, just a few adjustments to help us all succeed together." I glanced at the document, which outlined requirements for weekly lawn mowing, approved plant species, fence heights, and even regulations about outdoor furniture placement. At the bottom was a note about fines starting at $50. "Mrs. Sterling," I said, handing the paper back to her, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. My ranch predates your HOA by several decades. These regulations don't apply to my property." Beverly's professional mask slipped just slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Oh, Mr. Hartwell, I think you'll find that all properties within our community boundaries are subject to these standards." After Beverly left that morning, I sat on my porch for another hour, watching her white SUV disappear down the road. My daughter Sam called that afternoon. She's a property lawyer in downtown Austin and sharp as a tack when it comes to legal matters. When I told her about Beverly's visit, I could practically hear her raising an eyebrow through the phone. Dad, did you check the property lines recently? HOAs can be tricky about defining their jurisdiction. That evening, my grandson Lucas came by after school, all excited about a new camera drone he'd gotten for his birthday. Grandpa, can I film some of your geology experiments from the air? My science teacher said aerial footage would be perfect for my water erosion project. I smiled and ruffled his hair. Sure thing, kiddo. In fact, I think we might have some very interesting water patterns to study from above in the coming weeks. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Beverly Sterling's visit was just the opening move in a larger game. As I lay in bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, I found myself thinking about water. Water always finds a way, I'd taught my students for decades. Sometimes that new route can surprise everyone involved, including the water itself. The second letter arrived exactly 1 week later, this time delivered by a young man in a uniform that looked official, but wasn't quite right. Officer Derek Phillips, as he introduced himself, appeared to be in his late 20s, with the kind of build that suggested he spent a lot of time at the gym, but not much time using those muscles for actual work. His security uniform was crisp and covered in patches and badges that seemed designed to impress, though I noticed none of them were from any law enforcement agency I recognized. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," he said, standing unnecessarily straight. "Mrs. Sterling asked me to deliver this compliance notice personally and to conduct a brief assessment of the property situation." The letter was more formal than Beverly's first attempt, typed on official HOA letterhead and filled with legal-sounding language about community standards violations and escalating enforcement procedures. According to the document, my property's native grass areas exceeded approved height limits, my mesquite trees hadn't been properly trimmed to neighborhood specifications, and my rustic fence posts didn't meet aesthetic guidelines. The fine was set at $50 for the first violation, with subsequent fines doubling each time. What caught my attention wasn't the threats or the money, it was the signature at the bottom. Beverly Sterling hadn't just signed as HOA president, she'd added a title I hadn't seen before, Community Excellence Coordinator. "Officer Phillips," I said, studying the young man who was now taking photographs of my property with a high-end camera. "I'm curious about something. This uniform of yours. Are you with the sheriff's department? State police?" Derek's chest puffed out slightly, and he adjusted one of his many badges. "I'm a certified HOA security officer, sir, fully authorized to investigate compliance issues and document violations throughout Pristine Valley Estate." He said it with the kind of pride usually reserved for astronauts, though I suspected his certification had come from an online course rather than a police academy. Over the next few days, Derek began what I can only describe as a surveillance campaign. Every morning at precisely 7:30, his white security vehicle would appear at the edge of my property, positioned so he could observe the ranch house and front gate. He'd sit there for hours, sometimes getting out to take more photographs, occasionally walking along the public road that bordered my land. At first, I tried the friendly approach. I'd wave when I saw him, sometimes walk over to offer him a bottle of water or ask how his day was going. Derek was polite but professional, always mentioning that he was conducting routine compliance monitoring. By the end of the first week, Derek's presence had become part of our daily routine. Lucas thought it was hilarious and started timing how long Derek would stay each day. "Grandpa, he's like the world's most boring reality show." Day 7, security officer continues staring at grass. Grass remains unchanged. Sam was less amused when she visited that weekend. She'd been researching HOA law and had some interesting findings to share. "Dad, I've been looking into Pristine Valley Estates, and there are questions about their boundaries. The original development plans show them encompassing the area around your ranch, but the legal descriptions are vague about existing properties." That's when things took an interesting turn. Mrs. Dorothy Chambers, my 74-year-old neighbor who'd lived in these parts even longer than I had, stopped by Sunday afternoon with fresh cookies and some gossip that caught my attention. "Walter, that Beverly woman has been going door to door in the development, showing off some kind of application for a county award. She's telling everyone this community could be featured in magazines and that property values could increase by 20% if they win some excellence prize." Mrs. Chambers had worked as a secretary in the county courthouse for 30 years before retiring, so she knew how these things worked. "She's also been asking pointed questions about you, Walter. How long you've lived here, whether you've ever had any legal troubles, what your property taxes look like." The more I learned about Beverly's ambitions, the clearer her strategy became. This wasn't just about community pride, this was personal. Beverly Sterling needed a perfect community to win her award, and my ranch represented the one obstacle she couldn't control through normal HOA channels. Derek's daily visits weren't random harassment, they were reconnaissance. Beverly was gathering information, looking for any violation or legal weakness she could exploit to force me into compliance. Monday morning brought a new development. Derek didn't just park at the edge of my property, he positioned his vehicle directly across from my front gate, blocking the view from my porch and making it difficult for visitors to access my driveway without maneuvering around his car. When I walked out to address this escalation, Derek was ready with an explanation. "Mr. Hartwell, I've been authorized to maintain a closer monitoring position due to ongoing compliance concerns. This location provides optimal visibility for documenting any further violations." His tone was professional, but there was something else there. Satisfaction, maybe even smugness. I stood there for a moment, looking at this young man in his uniform, sitting in his security vehicle, convinced he was wielding some kind of power over a retired geology professor and his family. Derek had no idea that he'd just positioned himself in exactly the spot I'd been hoping he'd choose. You see, during my decades of teaching, I'd learned that the best way to handle a difficult situation was often to let it develop naturally, until the solution became obvious to everyone involved. Derek Phillips and Beverly Sterling were about to learn something about water flow that wasn't covered in any HOA manual. That night, I pulled out my old geological survey maps of the property and studied them under my desk lamp while Lucas did homework at the kitchen table. "Grandpa, what are you looking at?" he asked during a break from math problems. "Just checking some old drainage patterns, kiddo. This area has some interesting hydrology that I think we might want to document for your science project." Sam called that evening to update me on her legal research. "Dad, I think you should know I found the original property surveys from when you bought the ranch. The boundaries are very clear, and Derek's new parking spot is definitely on our land." I thanked her for the information and hung up with a smile. Sometimes the best solutions teach multiple lessons at once. Derek Phillips had been parking in the same spot for 2 weeks when I decided it was time to turn the situation into a learning opportunity. As a retired geology professor, I'd spent most of my career teaching students about practical applications, how water shapes landscapes, how soil composition affects drainage, and how understanding these natural processes can solve real-world problems. Derek and Beverly were about to get a hands-on education they'd never forget. The first thing I did was retrieve my old surveying equipment from the garage. Lucas was fascinated by the instruments, especially when I explained how geologists use them to map terrain. "Grandpa, are we going treasure hunting?" he asked, peering through the transit. "Something like that," I replied, showing him how to read measurements. What we were really doing was confirming what I already suspected. Derek's daily parking spot sat directly in a natural drainage channel that hadn't been active due to our recent drought. Mrs. Chambers proved invaluable during this research phase. During one of her afternoon visits, she mentioned that Beverly had been making rounds with a professional photographer. "She's having pictures taken of every house, every lawn, every mailbox," Mrs. Chambers reported. "These photos are apparently going to be part of her award application. She's also been asking newer residents to sign a petition supporting her nomination." This confirmed my understanding of Beverly's motivations. This award meant everything to her, possibly a stepping stone to bigger political ambitions. Derek's daily routine had become predictable to the point of comedy. Every morning at 7:30 sharp, he'd arrive and position his vehicle in exactly the same spot. He'd spend the first hour photographing my property from various angles, then settle in for what he called compliance observation. Lucas had started keeping a detailed log of Derek's activities, treating it like a scientific study. Day 14. Subject arrived at 0730 hours. Photographed the mesquite tree for 6 minutes. Appears to be documenting grass growth patterns. Fascinating behavioral patterns observed. Meanwhile, Sam's legal research was uncovering interesting details about Beverly Sterling herself. The HOA had been incorporated just 3 years ago, with Beverly as its founding member. More intriguingly, Sam discovered that Beverly had filed paperwork not just for the Community Excellence Award, but for several other recognitions, including Outstanding New Development and Innovative Community Leadership. Beverly Sterling was clearly building a political resume, with Pristine Valley Estates as her showcase project. One morning, while Derek was conducting his surveillance, I decided to test a theory. I walked out carrying a hydrology textbook and positioned myself near Derek's car. "Good morning, Officer Phillips," I said, cheerfully. "Beautiful day for studying watersheds, don't you think?" When Derek looked confused, I continued. "You're spending so much time observing this area, I thought you might appreciate the geological features. This whole region has fascinating drainage patterns." I showed him diagrams of elevation changes and water flow. Derek politely declined to look closely, but I could see his curiosity was piqued. The next day, I brought out field notebooks and spread them on the front porch where Derek could see them. I made sure to work with charts showing water flow patterns and elevation changes. When Derek inevitably approached to ask what I was doing, I explained I was reviewing research I'd conducted years ago. "This land has unique characteristics," I told him, pointing to a topographical map. "These elevation changes create natural channels for rainwater. During droughts you can't see them, but when we get good rain, water follows these exact patterns." Derek seemed genuinely interested, which surprised me. "So this area floods?" he asked, looking around at the seemingly flat ground where he parked daily. "Not floods exactly," I corrected, "but water accumulates in predictable patterns based on underlying geology. See these contour lines? They show how water flows across this landscape." Derek studied the map for several minutes, then asked if I'd ever seen water collect where he usually parked. I smiled and told him that particular spot was especially interesting from a hydrological perspective, though he'd probably never notice anything unusual unless we had a significant weather event. That evening, I called my old friend Professor Martinez from the university's Earth Sciences department. After catching up, I mentioned my current situation with the HOA. Professor Martinez laughed when I described my educational approach to the problem. "Walter, you haven't changed a bit. Still teaching lessons, whether people want to learn or not." We discussed various demonstration techniques, and he reminded me about methods we'd used where students created models to understand water flow. Of course, he added, the most effective demonstrations happen during actual weather events. I spent the next few days monitoring weather reports with unusual enthusiasm. The meteorologists were predicting a significant storm system moving through the area within a week, the kind of spring rain that could drop several inches in a short period. This was exactly the kind of real-world data that would make my demonstration both educational and memorable. As Derek continued his daily observations, I began preparing what I privately called Project Hydrology, though Lucas insisted on calling it Operation Soak the Spy. The beautiful thing about geology is its predictability. Water follows physics, and natural drainage patterns are determined by elevation and terrain. All I had to do was help nature reveal what was already there, waiting for the right conditions to become visible. But first, there was one more piece of the puzzle I needed to put in place. Lucas had been experimenting with his drone, getting increasingly skilled at aerial photography. "Grandpa," he said one evening, "what if I could film the whole thing from above when the rain comes? We could document everything for science." I smiled at his enthusiasm. Sometimes the best research assistants come in the smallest packages. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early April, when Derek Phillips crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. I was enjoying my morning coffee when I noticed Derek wasn't just observing from his usual spot, he was actually walking around my property, taking measurements with a tape measure and making notes. When I called out to ask what he was doing, Derek informed me that he was conducting a comprehensive boundary assessment to ensure accurate violation documentation. The audacity struck me like lightning. This young man believed he had the right to survey my land without permission. Sam arrived that afternoon with professional land surveyor Mike Rodriguez, whom she'd hired to settle the boundary question once and for all. Mike was a no-nonsense guy in his 50s who'd been surveying Texas properties for over 25 years. As he worked, setting up equipment and taking precise measurements, he shook his head in amazement. "Mr. Hartwell, that security officer has been parking about 15 feet inside your property line for weeks. This isn't even close to being a boundary dispute. He's been trespassing every single day." Mike showed us the official survey markers, some original boundary stones from the 1800s, others newer metal markers installed when I bought the property. When Derek arrived for his afternoon surveillance session, I was ready. Armed with Mike's fresh survey report and feeling confident about my legal position, I walked over as he was setting up his camera equipment. "Officer Phillips," I said, keeping my voice friendly but firm, "I have some information that might interest you. It turns out you've been parking on private property for several weeks." Derek looked confused, so I showed him the survey report. According to this professional survey, your usual parking spot is approximately 15 feet inside my property line. I'm going to have to ask you to move to the public road. Derek's reaction was predictable. He became defensive, claiming his position was based on official HOA boundary determinations and that he had full authority to monitor compliance within HOA jurisdiction. I listened patiently, then gently pointed out that HOA jurisdiction couldn't override private property rights established by legal surveys and deed records. Derek then made his first serious mistake. He called Beverly Sterling on his radio and asked for instructions while I was standing right there listening. Beverly's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained irritation. "Derek, maintain your position and continue monitoring. I'll handle the property owner." Within minutes, Beverly's white SUV was speeding up the road. She emerged like a general preparing for battle, carrying an expandable file folder and wearing an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. This was the first time I'd seen Beverly when she wasn't trying to be charming, and the difference was remarkable. "Mr. Hartwell," Beverly began without preamble, "Officer Phillips is operating under direct authorization from the Pristine Valley Estates Board of Directors. We have concerns about ongoing violations that need monitoring and documentation." I showed her Mike's survey report, pointing out clear boundary markers and explaining that Derek had been trespassing for weeks. Beverly glanced at the documents but didn't seem particularly interested in legal details. Instead, she opened her file folder and extracted what appeared to be an emergency HOA board resolution, drafted so recently the ink was barely dry. According to this new resolution, any property that negatively impacted community aesthetic standards could be subject to enhanced monitoring procedures until compliance was achieved. The resolution gave Derek specific authority to maintain optimal observation positions for documentation purposes, and declared that community safety and standards supersede individual property preferences. Beverly presented this document with the kind of flourish usually reserved for royal proclamations, clearly expecting me to be intimidated. I read through the resolution carefully while Beverly and Derek waited for my response. The document was impressive in its creativity, but it had one fatal flaw. "Mrs. Sterling," I said finally, "this is certainly an interesting interpretation of HOA authority. However, I noticed this resolution was passed yesterday, after Derek had already been parking on my property for weeks. You can't retroactively authorize trespassing that already occurred." Beverly's professional mask slipped entirely, revealing the frustration and determination underneath. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. Beverly Sterling, president of the Pristine Valley Estates HOA and aspiring winner of the Community Excellence Award, essentially declared war on my family. She informed me that Derek would be maintaining enhanced surveillance of my property, that additional violations would be documented and fined daily, and that the HOA would be exploring all legal options to ensure community standards were maintained. She also mentioned, almost casually, that she'd been in contact with county offices about unsafe conditions and potential environmental hazards on properties that didn't meet modern standards. That night, Beverly's threats weighed heavily on my mind. I sat in my study, looking at old photographs of the ranch while doubts crept in. Maybe I was too old for this fight. Maybe I should just sell and move somewhere quieter. Sam had warned me that fighting an HOA could get expensive, and Beverly clearly had resources I didn't. For the first time since this whole situation started, I felt genuinely discouraged. The ranch suddenly felt less like home and more like a burden. Lucas found me there around 9 o'clock, looking unusually serious for a 12-year-old. "Grandpa, are you okay? You seem sad." I tried to smile and brush off his concerns, but Lucas wasn't fooled. He sat down beside me and was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "You know what great-grandma used to tell Mom when she was scared about something?" I shook my head. She'd say, "Water doesn't fight the rock, honey, it just finds a way around it, and eventually the rock gives up." Mom told me that when I was worried about the school bullies. Looking at my grandson's earnest face, I felt something shift inside me. My mother had indeed been a wise woman, and Lucas had just reminded me of something I'd forgotten in my frustration. I wasn't trying to fight Beverly Sterling. I was simply going to find a way around her, just like water finds its way around obstacles. "You're absolutely right, kiddo," I said, pulling him into a hug. "Great-grandma was a smart lady, and you know what? I think it's time we started that water flow project you've been so excited about." The beauty of scientific method is its predictability. Water flows downhill. Clay holds water while sand drains. These aren't opinions. They're observable facts that have shaped landscapes for millions of years. As I prepared for what Lucas had dubbed Operation Soak the Spy, I reminded myself that I wasn't creating anything artificial. I was simply helping nature demonstrate principles that were already in effect, temporarily hidden by our drought conditions. Planning began the morning after my renewed determination. I consulted old field notes from geological surveys I'd conducted over the years. These contained detailed information about soil composition, drainage patterns, and seasonal water table variations. One notation from 1998 caught my attention. Significant pooling observed in northeast quadrant following 3-inch rainfall event. Natural depression creates temporary pond approximately 30 by 20 feet. Derek's parking spot sat directly in the center of this documented depression. Lucas proved to be an enthusiastic research assistant. Armed with his camera drone and science notebooks, he helped document the area around Derek's surveillance post. We photographed from multiple angles, measured elevations using my surveying equipment, and collected soil samples to test clay content and water retention. Lucas approached the project with genuine scientific curiosity, asking detailed questions about hydrology and taking careful notes. While we worked, Lucas had been busy with his own creative project. "Grandpa, look what I made!" He showed me a detailed model he'd constructed using clay, sand, and small rocks in a clear plastic container. "It's Derek's parking spot. Watch what happens when I add water." He poured a cup of water onto one end of the model, and we watched as it flowed down channels, collected in the depression where he'd placed a small toy car, and gradually formed a miniature pond. The car's completely stuck, just like Derek will be. Derek, meanwhile, had settled into his new position on the public road with military-like determination. From his elevated vantage point, he continued photographing my property and documenting what he considered ongoing violations. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me through binoculars as I conducted my research activities. Derek had no idea that every measurement I took was building toward a demonstration that would rival anything I'd created for university classes. Sam visited that weekend with a briefcase full of legal documents and a determined expression. She'd been researching HOA law and had discovered interesting precedents related to harassment and property rights. "Dad, I've found several cases where courts ruled against HOAs that overstepped their authority pursuing aesthetic compliance. If Beverly pushes this too far, we have strong options." But Sam also brought concerning news. Beverly had been making inquiries with county offices about property taxes, zoning violations, and environmental regulations that might apply to non-conforming properties. The weather forecast finally provided the opportunity I'd been waiting for. A major storm system was approaching from the west, with predictions of heavy rainfall over 24 hours. Local meteorologists were calling it a significant weather event and warning residents to prepare for possible flooding in low-lying areas. I spent Monday evening double-checking calculations about drainage patterns and water flow, then called Professor Martinez to discuss the educational potential of the coming demonstration. "Walter," he laughed, "you're turning a property dispute into a graduate-level hydrology lesson." Tuesday morning dawned gray and humid, with the kind of atmospheric pressure that makes animals restless. Derek arrived at his usual time, but I noticed he'd brought an umbrella and thermos of coffee, suggesting he planned to maintain surveillance despite the predicted storm. Beverly made an appearance around 10 o'clock, driving slowly past while talking on her cell phone and gesturing toward the ranch house. She was probably coordinating with Derek or updating board members about the situation. As afternoon progressed, the sky darkened and wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain across the hills. Derek repositioned his vehicle several times, apparently trying to find optimal surveillance that provided both good visibility and protection from the approaching storm. Each time he moved, he ended up closer to the natural depression I'd been studying, though he seemed oblivious to the subtle elevation changes my trained eye could easily detect. Rain started around 6 in the evening, a gentle sprinkle at first, then gradually increasing to a steady shower. By 8 o'clock, it had become the kind of downpour that turns streets into temporary rivers and makes sensible people stay indoors. Derek, however, remained committed to his mission. I could see him through the rain, sitting in his vehicle with wipers running, occasionally using a towel to clear condensation from windows so he could continue observing my property. Lucas and I positioned ourselves on the covered front porch with hot chocolate and my old field glasses, ready to observe what I predicted would be a textbook demonstration of natural drainage principles. "Grandpa, how long do you think it'll take?" Lucas asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Patience, kiddo, I replied, adjusting the binoculars' focus. Water works on its own schedule. We're just here to observe and learn. As rain continued falling, I began seeing subtle signs I'd expected. Small rivulets forming along natural channels, water beginning to collect in low-lying areas, and gradual saturation of soil that had been dry for months. Around 10:30, Derek made his final position adjustment of the evening, moving his vehicle to what he apparently thought was higher ground, but was actually the exact center of the natural depression my field notes had identified. Through binoculars, I could see him settling in for what would probably be an uncomfortable night of surveillance. Lucas had his drone charged and ready. "Should I get it in the air now, Grandpa?" he asked eagerly. "Not yet," I replied with a smile. "Let's wait for the main event." Derek Phillips was about to receive the most comprehensive education in practical hydrology that any security officer had ever experienced, though he didn't know it yet. By midnight, the rain had intensified to what meteorologists were calling a 100-year storm event, and Derek was parked exactly where 40 years of geological data said he shouldn't be. Dawn broke cloudy and wet, revealing a landscape completely transformed by the night's rainfall. From my porch, I could see streams of water still running across roads that had been dusty just 12 hours earlier. But the most dramatic change was visible right in front of my property, where Derek Phillips' white security vehicle sat in the center of what could only be described as a small lake. The natural depression that had been invisible during months of drought was now fully revealed, holding several feet of muddy water that reflected the gray morning sky. Derek was awake and clearly panicking, though trying to maintain professional composure as he spoke frantically into his radio. From my vantage point, I could see him testing the water depth with a stick he'd found, desperately searching for a shallow route out of his predicament. The water level had stabilized just below his door handles, effectively trapping him inside his vehicle, unless he wanted to wade through knee-deep muddy water. Each time Derek tried starting his engine, the vehicle would lurch forward a few inches before the wheels began spinning uselessly in the saturated clay soil, creating a high-pitched whining sound that echoed across the water. Lucas practically bounced out of bed when he saw the results of our demonstration. "Grandpa, it's even better than my model. Look, you can barely see the car." He grabbed his drone controller and rushed outside. "This is going to be the best science project video ever." Mrs. Chambers appeared at her kitchen window across the way, coffee cup in hand, staring in amazement at the semi-submerged security vehicle. Within minutes, several other neighbors had gathered on their porches, pointing and taking pictures with their phones. I could already hear them discussing what would undoubtedly become the neighborhood's most talked-about story. Around 8 in the morning, Beverly Sterling's white SUV came racing down the road, kicking up spray from puddles. She slammed on the brakes when she saw Derek's situation, her perfectly composed expression cracking into something between horror and rage. She stepped out wearing rain boots, but clearly hadn't anticipated the extent of the flooding. As she waded through the shallow water at the pond's edge, her power suit gradually soaking up muddy water, I could hear her shouting instructions at Derek while simultaneously trying to understand how this disaster had happened. "Derek, what is this? How deep is it? Why didn't you move the car?" Beverly's voice carried clearly across the water. Derek rolled down his window slightly, looking thoroughly miserable. "Mrs. Sterling, the water came up so fast during the night. I tried to start the car multiple times, but it just keeps getting stuck in the mud. I called for a tow truck, but they said it'll be at least 2 hours before they can get here." This seemed like the perfect time for me to make an appearance. I walked down to the road, carrying a thermos of fresh coffee, and wearing the kind of sympathetic expression reserved for natural disasters and unexpected learning opportunities. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling, Officer Phillips," I called out, cheerfully. "Quite an impressive demonstration of local hydrology we have here this morning. I hope everyone's safe and sound." Beverly turned to me with an expression that mixed fury, suspicion, and growing realization. Her carefully styled hair was beginning to frizz in the humidity, and her designer pantsuit was stained with mud up to the knees. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite her obvious distress, "I suppose you're going to tell me this is some kind of natural phenomenon." I pulled out my weathered field notebook and flipped to the page containing my observations from 1998. "As a matter of fact, Mrs. Sterling, this is exactly what I'd expect to see in this location following a significant rainfall event. This depression has been collecting water during storms for decades. I have documentation going back 25 years. I showed her the relevant entries, complete with diagrams and measurements that precisely predicted the current situation. Lucas had gotten his drone airborne and was capturing aerial footage of the entire scene. "Grandpa, this is incredible. From up here you can see the whole water pattern. It's like a perfect illustration of everything you taught me about drainage." Beverly looked up at the drone with growing alarm. "Is that child filming this?" Beverly studied my notes with the intensity of a detective examining evidence, clearly looking for any sign that this was an elaborate hoax rather than a genuine geological phenomenon. "So, you're telling me that Officer Phillips just happened to park in the exact spot where this pond would form?" she asked skeptically. "Well," I said thoughtfully, "Derek chose his position quite logically, from a surveillance perspective. The location provided good visibility and appeared to be on level ground. The problem is that apparent level ground can be deceptive, especially in areas with a history of seasonal water collection. You see, Mrs. Sterling, during drought conditions like we've been experiencing, these natural depressions aren't visible to the untrained eye. But when you understand the underlying geology..." At that moment, a county vehicle pulled up to the scene. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez stepped out, followed by someone I didn't immediately recognize, a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase. "Morning, folks," Deputy Martinez called out. "We received reports of a possible traffic incident involving standing water." He looked at Derek's trapped vehicle and shook his head. "That's one I haven't seen before." The woman with the briefcase introduced herself as Lisa Chen from the county's emergency management office. "We're conducting assessments of flooding incidents following last night's storm. Is this a public road?" When Beverly confirmed it was, Ms. Chen began taking measurements and photographs. "Interesting. This appears to be a natural collection point. Do you have any historical documentation of flooding in this area?" I handed Ms. Chen my field notebook. As she reviewed my decades of observations, her eyebrows rose steadily. "Mr. Hartwell, this is remarkable documentation. Are you aware that the county is currently developing new stormwater management guidelines? This kind of data is exactly what we need to understand natural flood patterns." Beverly's face had gone pale. "I don't understand. This is supposed to be a controlled, planned community. How can there be flooding in the middle of our development?" Ms. Chen looked up from my notes. "Ma'am, are you the HOA president? I think we need to discuss some compliance issues with county drainage regulations. From what I'm seeing here, this natural water collection system should have been preserved during development, not ignored." Derek, still trapped in his vehicle, made another attempt to start the engine. The motor roared and whined as the wheels spun futilely in the mud, sending up sprays of muddy water and drawing laughter from the growing crowd of onlookers. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Maybe you should try swimming to shore." The tow truck finally arrived around noon, creating quite a spectacle as it attempted to extract Derek's vehicle from its muddy prison. Lucas captured every moment with his drone, narrating like a nature documentary filmmaker, and here we see the security vehicle in its unnatural habitat, having failed to adapt to changing environmental conditions. The extraction process took nearly 2 hours and required the tow truck, several volunteers with shovels, and Derek pushing from behind while wearing borrowed rain boots. When his vehicle finally emerged, with a tremendous sucking sound, it was covered in mud from bumper to bumper, and Derek's dignity was thoroughly waterlogged. 3 days later, I received a phone call that caught me completely off guard. County Commissioner Robert Hayes was calling about what he described as an interesting situation involving community development and environmental conservation. Apparently, Ms. Chen's report about our impromptu hydrology demonstration had reached the highest levels of county government. "Mr. Hartwell," Commissioner Hayes explained, "we've been developing new guidelines for community planning that better integrate natural drainage systems. Your documentation of water patterns over several decades is exactly what we need." Beverly Sterling had been conducting damage control, making her own calls to county offices. Instead of filing complaints against me, she found herself facing questions about Pristine Valley Estate's compliance with drainage regulations and environmental impact assessments that should have been conducted during original development. When Commissioner Hayes and his team arrived the following Monday, they were accompanied by a state environmental agency representative, a hydraulic engineer, and a county newspaper journalist. Sam had taken the day off work, and Lucas had prepared a presentation including his drone footage and before and after photos of Derek's aquatic adventure. Commissioner Hayes was particularly fascinated by my documentation of natural water patterns. As we walked around the property, I showed him how native plants manage seasonal flooding, how natural depressions served as temporary water storage, and how these systems actually prevented erosion and flooding in the broader area. This is exactly the integrated approach we need to encourage, he said, reviewing my field notes. Too many developments ignore natural systems and create expensive drainage problems. Beverly arrived halfway through the county's visit, clearly hoping to salvage her community excellence campaign. She carried a portfolio filled with photographs of pristine valley estates in its manicured perfection. However, as she listened to Commissioner Hayes praising my innovative environmental stewardship and discussing sustainable landscape management, I could see her plans crumbling like a sand castle at high tide. The county's hydraulic engineer was especially interested in Lucas's aerial footage. "This drone video clearly shows the natural flow patterns," he explained. "See how the water follows these channels? This is a textbook example of how development should work with natural systems instead of fighting them." Commissioner Hayes interrupted Beverly's attempts to redirect the conversation. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm afraid I have concerning news about your nomination. The county has received complaints about potential drainage violations within your development. It appears that during original construction, natural water channels may have been altered without proper permits or environmental impact studies." Ms. Chen stepped forward with a thick folder. "Our investigation has revealed several discrepancies. The original development plans show natural drainage areas that appear to have been paved over or diverted without proper assessment. Mr. Hartwell's documentation proves these water channels have been active for decades." The journalist, who had been quietly taking notes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm working on a feature story about sustainable community development. Given recent events, my editor is very interested in examining how HOAs handle environmental compliance. Would you care to comment on allegations that pristine valley estates violated county drainage regulations?" That afternoon, Commissioner Hayes made an unexpected announcement. "Mr. Hartwell, based on your decades of environmental stewardship and documentation, I'd like to officially recognize Hartwell Ranch as the county's first certified sustainable property. This designation comes with tax benefits and protection from future development encroachment." Over the following weeks, the story took on a life of its own. The newspaper article, titled "Retired Professor's Ranch Becomes Model for Sustainable Development," was picked up by environmental blogs and even a national science magazine. Lucas's drone footage of Derek's trapped vehicle became an internet sensation, spawning countless memes about HOA karma and natural consequences. Beverly Sterling's reign as HOA president ended with a vote of no confidence from Pristine Valley Estates residents. Several homeowners, impressed by the county's praise for sustainable practices, had begun questioning the HOA's rigid aesthetic requirements. During the heated board meeting that led to Beverly's ouster, one resident stood up and said, "Maybe instead of trying to make everything look perfect, we should learn from Mr. Hartwell about working with nature instead of against it." Beverly left the area quietly that fall, selling her house to a young family excited about living in an environmentally progressive community. Derek Phillips enrolled in environmental science courses at the local community college, admitting, "Turns out there's a lot more to land management than I realized." 6 months later, Commissioner Hayes announced that the county had adopted new development guidelines requiring environmental impact assessments for all planned communities. Properties demonstrating sustainable land management practices were eligible for recognition through the county's new Environmental Excellence Program. Pristine Valley Estates, under new leadership, was among the first communities to apply for certification. As I sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky orange over land that my family has called home for 40 years, I often think about Beverly Sterling and her dreams of artificial perfection. Water still flows according to the same principles that shaped landscapes for millions of years. The difference is that now more people understand these principles and the value of working with natural systems rather than trying to control them. Sometimes the most important lessons come disguised as problems. Beverly thought her problem was my unkempt ranch. Derek thought his job was to monitor compliance. But what they really encountered was a demonstration that nature's systems are more powerful and enduring than any human attempt to override them. In the end, that's what good education has always been about, helping people see what was already there, waiting to be discovered.
From all of us here at QA Stories, thank you for watching. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.